A new Bank Act will allow state-owned entities to compete in that sector. The bill will also strengthen the Reserve Bank's ability to wind down a financial institution, particularly relevant in the light of the VBS debacle. Let's speak to Chantel van Zyl of Baker McKenzie and Nobambo Mlandu, I hope I got your name right, from the Banking Association of South Africa. Thanks so much for your time, ladies. Appreciate it. Chantel, let's start with you. Tell us what this amendment actually means for banking in South Africa.
So it's a surprisingly small amendment to the Banks Act itself that simply takes away the obstacle of saying that only public companies, which excludes state-owned companies, can apply for a banking license, which means that certain of the state-owned entities that operate as a quasi-bank at this stage, such as the Post Bank or the Land Bank, could now apply for a full banking license to operate as a commercial bank on the same playing field as all the other banks. Subject to, of course, complying with all of the same requirements.
Yeah. Nobambo, tell us how this will be beneficial to South Africans, if at all.
In our view, bringing all entities that offer financial services within the same regulatory framework would create a level playing field and create opportunities for, as Chantel mentioned, entities that were somewhat outside the scope, but providing the services, and therefore which would have been subject to lighter touch. So this would just create a play level field, provided that the same legislative, regulatory, and supervisory framework applies to those state-owned entities.
So you do have some reservations, because I read your representations and comments on the issue. Tell us about those reservations.
So, I mean, part of our reservations relate to, one, the funding of a state-owned bank, not just the setup costs, but just the ongoing costs that apply to banks. Because in a state-owned enterprise, where is that money coming from? Is that creating a burden on the taxpayer? So some of those are some of our concerns. And also, I mean, we are aware in terms of the challenges facing state-owned entities, and we cannot be blind to that. And therefore, I mean, luckily, in terms of the Financial Matters Amendment Bill, it provides that certain state-owned enterprise will be eligible to apply, and that there will be prerequisites attached to such a state. So it's not free for all for state-owned, but I mean, we are concerned in terms of governance structures within state-owned enterprises. We are concerned in terms of just the funding mechanism and the burden on the taxpayer at the end of the day.
But this could lead to more and better competition, Chantel, because we know that many people complain that South African banks charge too much for certain things, which is not seen in other countries.
So it's an interesting thing, because the Post Bank itself has a mandate to be providing services to especially people in rural areas, people in lower income classes. It's looking towards doing more lending towards SMMEs and to entrepreneurs and to small agricultural enterprises. So in that sense, it's not competing directly with some of the commercial banks. I mean, it is competing with some of the newer ones, such as your Time Digital, your Bank Zero, your Africa Bank, and maybe even your Capitec. But it means that there's two different levels of competition here. The other level of competition will be state tenders, and that's one of the things that, you know, a lot of people have questioned. Will the playing field still remain even when it comes to state funds?
Yeah. Now, BASA is also recommending a joint approach when it comes to how this act is actually amended. Your concerns are actually quite warranted, given, you know, what you said just now about how a state bank would run itself, where the taxpayers' money is still going to be used ultimately to run it.
Yes.
Are you getting any joy on that recommendation?
Look, time will tell with regard to this thing as to how the business model of the state-owned enterprise. Because in our view, once a state-owned company applies and qualifies to be registered as a bank under the Banks Act, it would do business the similar way that commercial banks are currently doing. So it is not clear in our minds as to what is the differentiating factor that a state-owned bank would provide under the regulatory framework, which is the Banks Act, in terms of capital requirements, in terms of liquidity requirements, and all those things that apply to a commercial bank at this stage. However, we do take cognizance that perhaps this could be another avenue of reaching out to underserved communities or unserviced communities, and therefore we're keen just to see how, like, clarity on the business model that would apply, that would make it different to how a commercial bank as of today operates.
Yeah.
Is what is key for us.
The EFF has been quite loud about a state-owned bank. They've called for a state bank for a very long time. It seems like that's going to happen ultimately. Do you think there's too much political pressure for this to happen? Is there a real necessity for a state bank in South Africa?
So, for me, I think that financial inclusion has been a topic for some time, and the Post Bank has been on the cards since about 2009. It was first reported in the SARB reports. We've steadily been moving towards that because of their location, because they have offices in areas where we don't have bank branches, where it might not be commercially viable for the commercial banks to be opening branches. So for that purpose, I think that, you know, a state-owned bank could serve a great purpose. However, of course, what the political agenda is behind mooting a state-owned entity being a bank and what they actually want to do with it, that's the question.
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
I share Chantal's sentiment. Because at the core of what is it that the state-owned bank would do differently under the licensing, within the licensing of under Banks Act? Because the Banks Act creates a framework as to how you can operate. However, each bank chooses which business model they want. I mean, we're seeing entrants where new entrants in the market where they're deciding to do digital platform without the need for the infrastructure and branch network layout. And therefore, the banking is changing. So it would be curious to see what it is that they're hoping to achieve and how they hope to achieve that.
Well, affordability would be one of the main things that we would hope a state bank would take into consideration when it does start up, isn't it? And that ultimately means competition for the big four banks in South Africa, which really is a good thing. I mean, can we see this lead to, Chantal, banking fees in South Africa drop ultimately?
If they're going to be competing for government tenders, I think that we could see that type of fees drop. If they're going to be competing, not just the state-owned bank, but also the new entrants that we've just seen come in, if they're going to be offering the same services that some of the commercial banks are, then absolutely. The more competition there is in the market logically should drive the price down. The only question is, again, it's uncertain at this stage what the objective of the state-owned bank is, and from what we can see in the legislation of the Post Bank, their objective is aimed at the lower income groups and aimed at sort of unsecured lending. So it depends on where they're going to be competing, but absolutely we're seeing great developments in the banking market right now, whether state-owned or whether it's the digital revolution.
Yeah.
And I think that is going to have a big impact.
So you mentioned it at the beginning, the problems at state-owned entities. There's so many to list that I could spend an hour listing them. Can we actually trust a state bank if it's established, given the experience we've seen with SOEs?
I believe that the Prudential Authority as a regulator would need to apply their minds fairly and do the proper assessment like they would do any applicant, be it a state-owned company or any other public company. And as such, I mean, there are checks and balances in place to just qualify a bank. And like I said, I'll go back to what the amendment says. It doesn't give a free license for all. Certain state-owned companies that qualify meeting prerequisites. And with that, then I think one limits the scope and the scale of the rollout for the state-owned bank. And also, they would be subject to the same supervisory and regulatory oversight that banks are all required. So, in a sense, if it checks all the right boxes, it and the business model is sustainable, it's something that could work.
Yeah.
But we need to understand exactly what it is that they're hoping to be doing differently. If the state, what it is that they want to do.
Yeah.
And it's not just a political rhetoric kind of.
No, not to sound like a negative Nelly, but the reality is that SOEs are governed by rules and regulations that they still flout and lead to corruption,
yes.
wasting our millions of our money, taxpayers' money. Let's move on very quickly to this. It's also aimed at strengthening the ability of the Reserve Bank to manage and wind down financial institutions if need be, like VBS, for instance. What do you think about that specific amendment? Chantal?
Well, I mean, if I can take that, I mean, I don't think that amendment is in this particular financial matters amendment bill. It's in a different financial sector laws amendment bill, which talks to the resolution and orderly winding down of a financial institution. And I think it's an important move. I mean, this has been in discussions within the banking sector for years. Just to make sure that there is a framework that all banks will be subject to. And part of the concern that we have is that as part of this resolution bill, separate issue, is that there should be a deposit insurance fund. And it should be a privately funded insurance fund to take away the burden on the taxpayer. And therefore, question becomes, if we have a state-owned bank, how is that contribution going to be made? Where is the money going to come from to contribute to this deposit insurance fund, which is set to just secure and provide this orderly resolution and winding down in a case of a...
All right. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Thanks for coming in as well. That, of course, was Chantal van Zyl of Baker McKenzie and Nobambo Mlandu from the Banking Association of South Africa.